On today's Live Open Daily, we go over some comments from the developers of Batman Arkham Shadow and Alien Rogue Incursion, and the nitpicky thing that fans over the internet have decided to zero in on and basically express their dismay over the game and pretty much overreact as internet fans are wont to do. I'm your host, Live Open Mike, and I was set to come on to this podcast and go over all the information we got from Batman and from Alien, and I'm still going to do some of that. But I think, and this is no shock, that internet and especially the VR community failed to see the forest for the trees and zeroed in on one comment and interpreted it and twisted it into something negative, which I think in both of these cases is kind of overblown. But in general, I'm very excited for both of these games, and hopefully what I'm about to say will make you feel a little bit better about that if you were on the fence or worried about what the developers said. We'll start with Batman Arkham Shadow. This game is coming to us from Camouflaj. This is a first-party studio from Meta. The previous titles were a game called Republic that is actually free in VR. You can play that for free right now on Quest and on PC VR. And Iron Man VR, which originally dropped on PSVR 1 and was later ported to Quest when Meta bought Camouflaj. I thought Iron Man VR was a tremendous game. It really kind of nailed the feeling of what it felt like to be Iron Man. There were some people who said it was just a glorified shooter. To those people, I would ask, have you ever really seen Iron Man do action? Take out the Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. parts of it. Iron Man really just flies around and shoots things, so I don't really know what people were expecting there. Personally, I thought Camouflaj nailed it, and I'm excited to see what they do with Batman Arkham Shadow. Ryan Payton, the studio director and founder of Camouflaj, has been making the rounds in the media, going through and doing interviews, spreading more information about Batman Arkham Shadows, and the combat is really what got some of the internet community in a bit of an uproar, so I'll go over some of his comments here. Now, Ryan has done several interviews. There's a 30-minute interview on BMF Show's YouTube channel. I'll leave a link to that down below. But for purposes of this podcast, I'm going to use this interview on Android Central, written up by the excellent Nick Sutrich. Talking specifically about the combat, Ryan said, I'm just going to read from the article, "From the very beginning of the project, we knew that translating that classic, iconic rhythm-based Arkham combat into VR, so it felt like it was native to the platform, leveraged all the strengths of VR, but still felt not only like an Arkham game, but it felt like an evolution of the Arkham game continues to be the greatest challenge of this project. We tackled the most difficult thing from the very beginning. If we couldn't prove that we could deliver on the combat, then this game wasn't worth pursuing. When we pitched the game to Warner Brothers and our partners at DC, we had to prove to them that we had an execution plan in place for combat. Core Arkham combat entails a sense of feeling that you are doing crowd control. It's eternally referred to as spinning plate gameplay, since you as Batman will constantly have to counter enemies while fighting others off at the same time. Enemies wouldn't take turns trying to kill the Batman if he were a real life person, so why should this happen in a video game where you're supposed to embody him? And then back to Ryan Payton, we looked at the Arkham franchise and we also looked at other games in the VR space for inspiration, including Beat Saber for some of the rhythm, and also Super Hot VR for some of his time dilation to help make combat feel really intentional in terms of what you're doing as a player. We've been experimenting and iterating on this combat over the past 4 years to ensure that this is a really fantastic interpretation of the Arkham combat that is in a lot of ways the driving force of this game, like it is with other Arkham games." In addition to that, there have been some images that have been floating around from this interview around Reddit and Facebook groups and all over the internet here. One of the images people kind of zeroed in on is you're in first person as Batman, you're throwing a right punch, and the enemy in front of you has a big gigantic or two big gigantic circles, one that says number 1 and one that says number 2. They're yellow. They basically look like punch targets. So taking from Ryan's comments and then combining that with this image, people were interpreting this to say that you had to punch in specific places to be able to knock enemies out, as opposed to do a free-flowing, brawling type of combat. Okay, so drilling into combat, VR combat in general is really, really tricky. It's different than aiming and firing with a gun where you can just knock out a bunch of enemies at once, or using a weapon that you can throw, or like a bow and arrow. If you're actually using your fists, then it becomes a little bit trickier because VR combat, I'm going to say this very clearly, VR combat is inherently limited by the physical prowess of the user. Hand-to-hand combat in virtual reality is inherently limited by how physical the player is. And I'm just going to tell the truth. I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. And here's where I say the quiet part out loud. A lot of gamers aren't in great shape, myself included. Some of the comments that I've seen around Reddit and places saying basically that if I want to be able to punch wherever I want to punch, I want to be able to hit 10 things at once, I want to move as fast as I want to. Okay, that's great for you. Your average player isn't going to be able to do that for more than about 5 to 10 minutes before their arms are ready to fall off. If you look back through some of the more like open straight brawlers in VR, you're looking at games like Path of the Warrior. Again, I personally enjoyed that game. Is like Streets of Rage or Double Dragon in VR, but there's still very specific hitboxes. If you hit anywhere near the head of the enemy in that game, they actually react as if you hit them directly in the face. You look at a game like Defector for one of Meta's other studios, Twisted Pixel, and in that game when you did combat, when the enemy swung at you, there was this like telegraph flash of color or something like that. Basically, it was like, I think it was red if you had to block the attack, and then it was green if you were able to hit the enemy in that specific place. It happened so fast and was so fluid, but if you were paying attention, you were able to basically get through that fight without too much difficulty, but it was so intuitive that it really felt natural within the game itself. Contrast that with something like Path of the Warrior, where you're just blindly swinging fists and knocking enemies out, and the second feels way more arcadey than I would like, whereas the first one felt like a nice fluid combat system. As for the time dilation, this is a thing that's been in VR for a very long time. You look at games like Assassin's Creed Nexus, again, the best example here is Superhot. Even Mixed Realms games like Hellsweeper and Sirento, if you were doing all the flippy stuff all over the place, there was still time dilation there, one for a comfort setting for the player, and two to telegraph movements. Enemy attacks in VR have been telegraphed in pretty much every VR game you can really think of, even if it's not this like big red flashing sign saying, hey, block here, or a green light saying, hey, punch here, kick here, move here, dodge here. There's always some sort of indication of what you're supposed to actually be doing. This is the same for Assassin's Creed Nexus. If you look at something like Venom Mortal, which is one of my favorite experiences in VR, you can always see when the enemy is about to attack you, whether they are raising their gun to fire at you, you can see them aiming. If they're hitting a weapon, they're going to wind up and throw the weapon at you. It's very, very easy to see when you're in first person, even in Resident Evil 4, in either version of that, the remake on PSVR 2 or the original on Quest. It's very plain to see when the enemy is about to attack you, and those motions feel more exaggerated in VR because you need longer to react than if you're just hitting the button on your controller. You have more fast twitch muscle fibers in your finger than you'd probably do in your entire body, and your shoulder and your back and your hips. So if you're having to do this whole thing physically with your entire body, you probably need a wider berth and a bigger time window to be able to counter effectively and actually get through the fight without getting overwhelmed. Now, I'm very relieved that Ryan Payton said that enemies will not attack you one at a time. This has been a criticism in gaming forever, where you will see enemies, you see this in movies too, especially martial arts movies, where you'll see a bunch of enemies like circling the main character while one goes in and attacks, gets their butt kicked, and then another one runs in. It tends to happen so fast, but it's still one at a time. I love the fact that in this game, you're going to get attacked by multiple enemies at once, and you have to be countering one while attacking another. That feels like Batman combat, and it feels like Arkham combat. However, this image, and I've got it up here for people who are watching the video version of this podcast, is what people really zeroed in on as I'm being directed as to what to do. And then an example of Super Hot. And then couple that with the examples of Beat Saber and Super Hot. Pretty much players were saying that they would not have the freedom to be able to make the combat their own. I think this is just one image and probably a bad example of what this is, but this is just another iteration of what I just talked about, with enemies telegraphing their attacks and you being told by the game, whether it's through these number symbols here. This is just another example of a VR game telling you, whether it's through some kind of like indicator on the HUD telling you to dodge left or right, like in Assassin's Creed Nexus, or something flashing at you like in Defector, or in this big telegraph windup where you see them bring their arm way back before they actually swing at you, or they say something, they scream something at you to signal for you to duck. And that's something that's in a lot of flat screen games too, where you can just see where the enemy's attack is coming from. It's not just a blind assault. This feels more along those veins, even though it's maybe a bit more pronounced as some people would like. This is not something new. This has existed in VR combat pretty much from the jump, because most developers know that not every VR player is going to be at the same level of physical prowess. Some are going to be a little bit slower with their reaction times, and you need to kind of even the playing field for all players. You're going to have some sort of warning system, whether it be that the punch actually slows down. There's going to be some kind of sound cue. There's going to be something to give you the time to be able to react to this. It's not going to be fast paced, 100% speed all the time. And I'm perfectly okay with that, because that's going to be more accessible to more players. And the fact that they're trying to nail the Arkham combat, which is really, really fast. If you go back and watch some gameplay footage of that, where Batman's just like throwing roundhouse kicks and flipping all over the place, you're not gonna be able to do that stuff in VR, because that will make people just absolutely throw up. So trying to nail that feel while also being as comfortable as possible is a bit of a tricky balancing act. I'm looking forward to see how they do it, and I'm not really gonna write this off just because of these comments from this developer. So everybody just calm down. Calm down. It's gonna be okay. Getting into elements of the story, we got a new trailer from the Summer Game Fest that had the voiceover from the Batman voice actor going over what we now know to be the Rat King as the title villain of the game. And there's more in this article from Android Central, so I'm going to read a bit more from it. Arkham Shadow takes place squarely between the events in Arkham Origin and Arkham Asylum during a particularly dark time in the Dark Knight's life. That's certainly saying a lot given the hero's origin stories. In Arkham Shadow, the city is being overrun with rats who carry a pestilence that drives people crazy, causing them to wreak havoc in ways they might never normally consider. This particular ploy is different from the Ratcatcher's normal poisonous gases though, and that's because he's not the one in charge. Rather, the Rat King is pulling the strings behind the scenes, creating a world that challenges Batman's ethos as a superhero. Batman isn't about killing, and would certainly never intentionally harm ordinary citizens, but the Rat King's wily ways are forcing Batman to make difficult choices. Payton says that this duo of bad guys was formulated in tandem with Warner Brothers and DC Comics, ensuring that the game not only feels like a mainline Arkham story, but also fits right in with the comics. Quote, if it's got an Arkham title on the box, it needs to have all the key elements, including not just combat or investigation, cinematics, and boss fights, but that core fluid locomotion. The Rocksteady team did such a great job with those titles, so that ability to run, slide, mantle up, and most importantly, use the grapple gun to get into positions of power, such as onto the vantage points that you have in Predator encounters, be able to zip onto the top of buildings, and things like that. If anyone's ever played the Batman Arkham VR game from Rocksteady, you're going to understand kind of what Ryan is talking about here. That game was a tech demo. If you shot your grappling gun to move from one spot to another, it was just a very simple node hop to go to one spot. When you got into the Batmobile, the game just faded to black and you could hear the Batmobile driving, but you were never actually in the car. It was essentially a standalone kiosk game where you stood and put together the evidence to figure out what exactly happened at each scene. There was no real movement. There was no real combat. Again, it was basically a tech demo. This, from what we're hearing from Ryan Payton and the team at Camouflaj, feels like a fully realized Batman game. I can't wait to play it. One more note about comfort, then we'll move on to Alien. Quote, Arkham Shadow is more friendly for a wider breadth of users, but we also don't have teleport locomotion options, in part because it would break the combat paradigm. We need players who will stay in a place for slow-mo combat, but we've learned so much about comfort in VR, not just as Camouflaj, the organization, but as an industry as a whole. Even in the initial prototypes, we're looking at core gadgets like the grapple gun, which you have from the very beginning of the game, as well as the batarang and how that factors into the core gameplay and puzzles. We don't want to reveal too many gadgets for now because it's fun to unlock them over the course of the campaign, but we can reveal that Arkham Asylum's explosive gel will be in this game. Fans will recall that Batman draws a nice little bat symbol in gel on any wall that can be exploded, and this gel can also be used as a trap for any bad guys walking by. Arkham Shadows' early explosive gel prototypes had players drawing the bat signal on the wall, but that proved to be less fun than initially thought. Payton said he found himself really quickly drawing just a little bit of gel onto a wall, just enough to make the gadget work so he could move forward. This inherent laziness goes against Batman's character, and Payton noted that I really didn't feel like I was Batman at that point. The team ended up turning the explosive gel into a projectile that forms the bat signal on the wall, instead ensuring that one of the series' trademark gadgets doesn't get ruined by human laziness. This is another point that I love because, again, they're taking all the considerations of the core franchise itself, but they're also thinking about the fact that there are certain things that don't translate well into VR. There's going to be a podcast later on this week that tells about storytelling in VR when we talk about Journey to Foundation. But the core point is that if you have a player doing mundane tasks too many times in VR, you're going to bore the player and they're going to want to move on. While it sounds cool to be able to draw the bat symbol in the gel on the wall, and trying to find that balance between authenticity to the franchise and frankly just not boring the player to tears is a balance that hopefully Camouflaj got right. We're going to find out this fall. Then there's Alien Rogue Incursion. This comes to us from Survios. You know Survios mostly for their game Creed Rise to Glory. To me, that is their best game, but they've also made some other games like a wave shooter that was pretty well received when it first came out, called Raw Data, and The Walking Dead Onslaught, which isn't my favorite game, but it does inform some of this discussion. That's why I bring it up. Probably the best story game is Westworld Awakening. That game tells a very rich story, but it's not particularly action heavy. This game, Alien Rogue Incursion, feels like a combination of all the things that they learned across their games. And we're taking notes from a developer who did an interview with IGN. It's about a 15-minute interview. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. Xenomorphs use a dynamic spawning system that reacts to your actions like sounds, for example, being clumsy, you're basically being hunted. Weapons being featured will be fan favorites like the flamethrower and the pulse rifle. Xenomorphs are fast, intelligent, and hard to kill. They attack from all angles and use walls, ceilings, and floors. That is very authentic to the franchise. That's going to be terrifying in virtual reality. This game isn't a stealth hide-and-seek experience and sounds pretty full-on action. The world is full of, and here's the main points. Aliens Rogue Incursion is being designed in a way that people can enjoy in short bursts, and the world is being designed to accommodate that style of gameplay. The thing that people zeroed in on is this line: the game is being designed to be played in short bursts. So a few things there. If you were listening to this podcast, you are more than likely a fairly large VR fan if you found this podcast and you're enjoying it, which means you probably can play VR for longer than 30 minutes. Your average person cannot. The average VR session, according to data from multiple different companies, is around 30 minutes. I interpreted this to mean that you're going to be playing in a mission-based setting where you're going to be able to complete an entire mission in about 20 to 30 minutes, a la something like The Walking Dead Onslaught, which again is not my favorite game. But in that game, you go on design like supply runs where you go into an environment, you have to get a certain number of supplies and they get to the extraction point and get out. Where you're going through missions, and some of them are stealth and some of them are combat heavy. Some of them are missions where you have to like tail a specific suspect without being seen. But every mission in that game can be completed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 minutes. And you can hop out and go on to the next one where they're playing as Ezio, Cassandra, or Connor. That was what I took away from this interview. Is it's not a game where it's going to be a straightforward, continuously moving narrative where you're going to be saving constantly, a la something like Red Matter or Saints and Sinners. That's a game that feels almost walking narrative in its way. This feels like, and the developer really said this, his name is TQ, the one who did the interview on IGN. He specifically used the phrase action horror. You contrast this with something like Alien Isolation, which I'm going to talk more about that game in a minute, but it feels like that's what people were hoping for. Alien Isolation, as good as that game was essentially a bit of a scavenger hunt and a walking narrative where you have to go in this room and activate these 3 switches in this order, or solve this puzzle, or grab these 3 items inserted to this generator, all while avoiding being hunted by the alien. That's all good and well, but that was essentially a very, very heavy stealth game with very middling combat, including when you fought the androids, or just shot a flamethrower at the alien to get it off of you. The very fact that you have a pulse rifle in this game tells me that this game is going to lean more into the action part of it, a la something closer to the Resident Evil series, and if that's what they're going for, I'm totally on board with that. Back to the short burst piece, again, I think this is overblown because if you go back through, I'll use Saints and Sinners as an example here, because that's considered one of the best VR games ever made. That is still a mission-based game. Yes, you can explore and scavenge and spend an hour to 2 hours doing one mission if you wanted to. You can also, because each mission had objectives, you either had to go activate a generator, or you had to go find this book with this intel and then go put the intel where someone else, one of your confidants, can reach it. You can very easily get to from point A to point B in the span of about 20 minutes, all while still scavenging and looking for things to salvage so you could upgrade your crafting stations. This game doesn't seem to have crafting, so if you cut that element out of Saints and Sinners, you're doing missions that only take about 20 minutes. This feels more akin to that, where maybe, hey, your objective here is to get to this room to activate this generator, but you have to shoot your way through a xenomorph nest for that. Or you have to avoid. Those games are all broken up into chunks where you can complete a section, save your game, then pop out and move on. So whether you have 30 minutes to play or 2 hours to play, you're still getting a pretty full experience. This whole thing I thought was overblown because the second they said short bursts, people were thinking, oh, it's going to be a short-based wave shooter and all you're going to do is just stand still and just shoot a bunch of aliens. That's not what he said. That's absolutely not what he said. And if you go and look through the whole context of the interview, he wasn't saying it was going to be quick bursts. You could put the game up and down in 5 minutes. He was saying more along the lines of the other stuff that they've made, like Raw Data, even though that is a wave shooter, but that is a game that each mission block only takes about 15 minutes, like Walking Dead Onslaught, like Creed, which is a game where you do a boxing match in a few minutes. You're going to be able to complete whatever objective you've had for that mission in just a few minutes and then pop back out if you want to. If not, continue on. I just rolled my eyes when I saw the reaction to this because I think people were expecting Alien Isolation. To talk more about Alien Isolation, I get that that's a great game and I get people remember it fondly. That game's also 10 years old. And if you're trying to bring games that are 10 years old into VR, are people really going to say, hey, I would love to fork out $600 to play a game that I played 10 years ago on flat screen and I can still play on flat screen right now? Is that really going to sell them on headsets? Just being honest, probably not. As much as we remember these games fondly, and I'm of a certain age where I'm right there with you guys, as much as we remember these games fondly, we would like to experience them new in the VR paradigm. For the general consumer, that's not going to connect because they know the game already exists. But if you give someone an original story, an original premise, and something that they can only play in VR, they can only play on this platform, well, that's something that's going to get them a little bit more interested than just rehashing an old story and presenting it in a new way. And if you look at the numbers most recently for like the Resident Evil 4 VR modes on PSVR 2 for Village and for Resident Evil 4 Remake, people aren't really turning out in droves to play those because they can already play them on another medium. So asking them to pay out $600 to play it in VR, enthusiasts will do that. Your common consumer will not. Last point, the developer said that they wanted to make a game that will make someone tear off their headset in terror. They talked about Creed being on TikTok where you would see people punching walls, punching family members, punching TVs. They wanted to create a feeling like that. But they have to find the balance of that because horror is not for everyone. Alien Isolation in its first 7 months of release sold 2 million copies. That's still a relatively decent success, and any VR developer will be doing backflips for that. But you compare that to games that have sold 2 million copies in their first weekend. Horror in general is not a genre that does massive numbers, and I think Survios knows this. So if they're going to make a hardcore straight through, you're going to get the absolute piss scared out of you horror game, they're inherently limiting the audience that they're going to be able to sell to. So the developer was very clear to say, we're giving you the means to defend yourself. You're going to have a pulse rifle. You're going to have flamethrower. You're going to be able to fend off the aliens. It's not a stealth game where you're constantly hiding in terror, because as good as Alien Isolation is, it appeals to a very core segment of players who love horror games. Whereas there's a bigger, wider swath of players who understand action games, and frankly, shooters in VR tend to do better than almost any other genre. All right, I'm done ranting. That's a wrap for this episode. If you want more live up on my content, there's this podcast on Spotify and on YouTube. I also upload other videos on my YouTube channel. You can also find me on X and on Twitter. All those are at Live Up and Mike. I'll talk to you tomorrow.